Hi there, this is Mr. Evans. This video looks at organisational culture. We're going to look at the importance of organisational culture and the influences on organisational culture in this video, and then I'll come back and look at Handy and Hofstede in later videos. So we can define organisational culture as the norms and values held by the individuals in an organisation that determine how those individuals behave. Culture is a really fascinating subject, and people make careers out of studying culture. We're engaged in cultures all the time. Every time that a group of people come together, a culture is created. So we're probably most familiar with national cultures, and these determine an awful lot about the way that society works. So whether the society is democratic or not, how people greet each other, how people treat elders in that society. And it's very difficult to see a culture when you're involved in it, and it often takes you to leave a culture for you to understand your own country a little bit better. So often travelling on holiday abroad, you see different ways of doing things and you think, wow, that's really interesting. Just a silly example, in the UK, people will often eat their dinner or supper in the earlier part of the evening, maybe between 6 and 7 or around those times, whereas in Spain the evening meal is taken much later. It's taken around 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So just things like that are a sign of different cultures, different ways in which people behave that are actually quite difficult for those people to interpret when they're in a culture. Now, you will so we've got our national culture, but within the national culture there's lots of different cultures, lots of different groups of people that you will be involved with. So for example, you're going to have a school culture. There is a culture at your school, and if you've ever changed schools, it's very obvious that things are done in different ways in different schools. How students wear their uniforms. There was a particular way when I was at school that we wore our ties if we wanted to be to slightly break the uniform code, and the people in the other school would wear their ties in a way that we wouldn't. These are quite silly examples, but they show that different groups of people adopt different values and behave in different ways, and that's really what culture is trying to understand. And you can see it when you maybe have different lessons during the course of the day. All right, you've got a school culture, but because of the teacher and the particular group of students within a classroom, cultures are sort of spring up naturally. So, I teach several groups that are very different from each other. The kind of atmosphere and the kind of ways in which students interact with each other in those groups are kind of quite different. So cultures spring up whenever a group of people come together, and that happens whether it's purposeful or not. Looking at organisational culture is really, really interesting. So what influences organisational culture? Well, the attitude and behaviour of leaders. Ingvar Kamprad was the guy who set up IKEA famously, and he became a billionaire, but he used to drive around an old tattered Volvo, the kind of legend has it, and that kind of behaviour of his, he didn't drive around a fancy sports car, that kind of reflected that he wanted IKEA to be about simplicity and saving money wherever we could, so those savings could be passed on to consumers. So the ways in which leaders behave can dictate the culture to a certain extent, and I'll talk about RBS in a minute. The organisational structure, is it a tall hierarchy where orders are passed down, in which case employees might get used to having to ask their boss for every time they want to do something, or is there empowerment? Is it a flat hierarchy? And is risk taking and entrepreneurship encouraged within an organisation? The policies and procedures that are in place. So, for example, I worked in one school, where to undertake a school trip you had to fill in endless forms. It was really, really difficult. to do that, and I've worked in other schools where it's far easier to create a school trip. So the policies and procedures, do you have to get everything signed off by someone above you, or are you trusted to do that? Again, I've heard of schools where the senior leadership check every letter that's sent out, whereas I've worked in schools where you're just trusted that you can send a letter out to parents without there being too much of a negative impact on the school. And that, dictates the way in which people behave. The age of the organisation, is it quite a new organisation where it's only just started, or is it been around for hundreds of years? That can dictate the way, the culture of an organisation. The size of the organisation, is it a big company or a small company? Do people get to interact with the leaders on a daily basis, or do they not know the leaders? The geographical location of the organisation and national culture, there'll be a video on that later on. The employees in the organisation and how they react with each other can determine the culture. The training that's provided to employees, are they trained to make decisions and take risks, or are they trained to ask their managers for permission to do things? The nature of the industry, is it fast moving? Is it kind of software development where you need to be creative or not? And the stories and symbols that are told by people within the organisation. What are people told when they arrive at the organisation? What information are they given about the leaders of the organisation, and what does that tell us about how people are going to interact with each other? So why is organisational culture important? Well, organisational culture is hugely important. It can be a source of differentiation. It can create a sense of identity for an organisation. It determines the attitudes of leaders and staff, and it determines the behaviour of leaders and staff, the unwritten rules of how things are done. So, just to pick an example from schools, I've worked in schools where there's kind of a culture amongst some students that it's not cool to work hard, it's not good to do your homework, or even it's not good to do what the teacher has told you to do. Versus I've worked in schools that are very different to that, and it creates a very different working environment, and students achieve very different outcomes depending on the culture amongst the school. So some organisations, so I'll just define this first. So a strong culture is one where everyone understands and buys into the culture of an organisation. So everybody kind of understands how to do things in that organisation and how it's done. Whereas a weak culture is one where employees don't understand the culture, or the practice of an organisation doesn't match its stated vision. So a strong culture tends to be one where, yes, we've set this as our mission statement. This is what we've said we're going to do. We're going to grow our company by treating customers fantastically, and staff are empowered to make decisions that are going to benefit consumers. That would be quite a strong culture where everything kind of adds up. A weak culture might be saying, yes, we want to please our customers and we want to make sure that we go out of our way to solve their problems. But maybe a member of staff gets into trouble because they've given a customer 50% off a product without getting permission from somebody above them. That would be quite a weak culture where the practice of the organisation doesn't actually match its stated vision. So just to look at some of these, the Virgin Group tends to have quite a strong culture led by their leader, Richard Branson. Google, the design of their offices, everything about the way that they do things at Google is about creating innovation and growing the company, basically. Staff are empowered to make decisions. And if you have a look at the Google offices, you can see how even the design of the offices reflects that culture. Anglian Water, it's a company arguably selling a boring product like water, but it's considered a very, very good organisation to work for, where they take care of their staff so their staff can take care of their customers. On the other hand, RBS, under their old boss Fred Goodwin, was described as a toxic culture where it got into real trouble in the financial crisis because they'd taken on a number of they'd made a number of acquisitions of companies that were in debt and high risk, and the whole company was about personal ambition and gain, and it was quite an unpleasant place to work, according to insiders there. So, very interesting company to think about, RBS, and how they got into trouble around 2008, and a lot of that was to do with their culture. Enron, another famous company, you can look it up, had arguably a strong culture, but it was all about cheating their customers. So, yeah, interesting topic. I could go on for a long time, but culture, the way things are done in a company, and they can be strong or they can be weak.